Imagine you are sleeping, suddenly a bang. The door is broken down. Police officers shout his name. You are dragged out of your house, handcuffed without understanding why. And the worst, you are innocent. Now imagine passing 15 years behind bars, forgotten by the world, while the real culprit remains free. How do you prove your innocence when no one wants to listen? How can you survive knowing that your freedom was taken away for no reason? This is not an isolated case. Miscarriages of justice happen every day. Innocent people are convicted without evidence, victims of flawed investigations, lying witnesses, and a system that often prefers a quick culprit to a difficult truth. Now, try to put yourself in these people's shoes. Years in a cell, where every day is psychological torture. Time passes, your family falls apart, your friends forget you, your dreams disappear. And the only question that echoes in the mind is, until when? But what happens when the truth finally comes out? When, after so much suffering, does justice admit its error and release the innocent? Does life just go back to normal? Or will the marks of this injustice never disappear? Is an apology enough? Can years of humiliation, pain, and abandonment be made up for? The system takes everything from these people, and when it finally lets them go, it simply turns its back. If this story revolts you, wait until you know the case we are going to tell you about today. In the end, I want to know, what would you do if justice failed you? Does justice really work, or just for some? How many innocent people still pay for the errors of a flawed system? Now tell me, what is the first word that comes to your mind when you hear this story? Comment here. Injustice. Each comment is a step against silence, a way of showing that we do not accept these absurdities as normal. Jake Thompson never imagined his life could turn upside down in a matter of minutes. Dedicated father, loving husband, and a tireless worker, he led a simple but happy life. Every day started early, the alarm clock went off before the sun rose, and soon he was up, preparing coffee, kissing his wife, and leaving for another day of work. His dream was to guarantee a better future for his son, to build something solid, something that would make every drop of sweat worth it. He never had any problems with the police. He never even received a traffic ticket. His only contact with justice had been watching the news, seeing distant cases that never seemed to have anything to do with his reality. But that night, everything would change. It was a quiet morning, with nothing unusual. Jake slept next to his wife, while his son rested in the next room. The silence in the house was broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall, but then came the knocking on the door. At first, it was just a muffled sound. 3 dry hits. Jake opened his eyes slowly, not understanding. Then came the second sequence, stronger, more aggressive. He sat up in bed, confused, trying to process what was happening. His wife woke up with a start, her eyes wide. "Who could be knocking at this hour?" she asked, voice shaking. Before he could respond, the door was broken open with a bang. A group of police officers invaded the house, weapons drawn, shouting orders that mingled with the noise of splintered wood. "Hands on your head! On the ground now!" Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't understand. He tried to ask what was happening, but before he could react, he was already being pulled by the arms, thrown against the cold floor of the room. His wife screamed in despair. The young son, now awake, was standing on the stairs, watching the scene with terrified eyes. Jake tried to turn away. He wanted to tell the boy everything would be okay, but a police officer's knee pressed into his back, pinning him to the ground. The cold metal of the handcuffs closed tightly around his wrists. "You are arrested!" The words fell upon him like a death sentence. He felt the bitter taste of injustice before he even understood what he was being accused of. As he was dragged out of the house, he heard neighbors whispering. Lights came on in the windows. Cell phones started recording. There, in the dead of night, his reputation was destroyed even before a trial. He was placed in the back seat of the squad car. The sound of the siren blasting in his ears, his heart beating against his chest as if trying to escape from. Within, the only thing he knew was that his life would never be the same. What if no one gave you the chance to prove the truth? If, from one moment to the next, your life was snatched away without explanation, without evidence, without justice? The revolt you feel now cannot be temporary. Stories like this continue to happen every day, and the more people know the truth, the greater the chance of preventing this from happening again. If you believe that these stories need to be told, leave your like now and help this message reach further. These voices cannot be silenced. Red and blue lights flashed against the walls of the house, casting distorted shadows on Jake Thompson's face as he was pulled unresistingly by his arms, handcuffed like a criminal. The deafening sound of the siren mixed with his wife's desperate cries and the confused screams of his son, who watched the scene without understanding why his father was being taken away in such a brutal way. Jake's world was crumbling before his eyes, and the only thing he could think was, this has to be a mistake. The police car door was forcefully opened, and before he could say anything, he was thrown inside like a disposable object. The cold metal of the handcuffs squeezed his wrists, and his mind was buzzing with questions that no one seemed willing to answer. He tried to speak, to argue, to ask what the charge was, but all he got back was an impassive look from the police officer in the front seat. Nobody cared what he had to say. The ride to the police station was a blur. His heart pounded in his chest, sweat ran down his forehead, but the only answer he received to his pleas was the sound of the police car's radio, where police codes were being exchanged as if his life were just another routine case. Upon arrival, he was unceremoniously dragged into the police station, while flashes from journalists' cameras captured every moment. Headlines were already written even before any trial. Man is arrested for barbaric crime. The sentence was already given before he even had the chance to defend himself. He was pushed against a wall, roughly searched and taken to an interrogation room, where finally a police officer looked him in the eye and spoke the words that would echo in his mind for years to come. "You were seen at the crime scene." Jake frowned, confused. What crime? Where? When? He knew exactly where he was. He knew he hadn't done anything. But when he tried to explain, when he tried to argue that it didn't make sense, he was interrupted with a sharp slap on the table. "Do you want to make things difficult for yourself?" His stomach turned. The system was not there to find the truth. The system wanted someone to blame. The hours passed cruelly. He was thrown into a filthy cell while the case was built against him. He hoped that justice would work, that the truth would prevail, that someone would realize the grotesque mistake that was being made. But then came the final blow. The public attorney was assigned to his defense, and he seemed more interested in ending the case quickly than in proving his innocence. "Better take a deal, Jake. This could be worse for you." Accept a deal? He didn't even know what he was being accused of. He hadn't done anything. How could he accept carrying a crime he didn't commit? But when he refused, when he insisted on his innocence, he realized the cruel reality in the lawyer's eyes. He was already doomed. The prosecutor didn't need evidence. The testimony of a single witness was sufficient. A single person who said they saw him near the scene of the crime. No real evidence, no deep investigation, no detailed verification. Just one word, a word that would seal Jake's fate for the next 15 years. What if no one let you talk? If your life was destroyed by an unfair accusation, and even though you were innocent, no one wanted to hear the truth? Jake lived this nightmare, just like thousands of people who have been forgotten by the system. Ignoring this is accepting that it continues to happen. If this story revolted you, share it now and help this truth reach more people, because tomorrow it could be any of us. Jake Thompson felt the weight of the iron bars closing behind him, the sound of metal echoing like a final sentence. The cold cell floor was his new reality, and the smell of mustiness and despair seemed to permeate the air. The first few days were hell. The fear was suffocating. Uncertainty gnawed at his mind, and revolt burned in his chest. How could that be happening? How could anyone survive being treated like a criminal when they knew they were innocent? The surrounding cells were packed with men who watched him like prisoners studying an intruder. Suspicious looks, cynical smiles, silent threats. Inside, no one asked if you were innocent or guilty. You were just one more. Another convict, another name erased from society, another body pushed into a cramped cell and forgotten by the world. He didn't belong there, but the system decided he did. The nights were the worst. The incessant sound of distant screams, banging on bars, heavy footsteps echoing through the corridors. Sleep has become an unaffordable luxury. Every noise was a threat, every shadow an imminent danger. Jake quickly learned that in prison, you don't lower your head, you don't show weakness, you don't trust anyone. But how do you stay strong when your mind is on the verge of collapse? The food was inedible, cold, served on metal trays that smelled of rust. He lost weight quickly, not only because of his lack of appetite, but because every meal was accompanied by humiliation. The simple act of eating was a risk, a push, a sideways look, a stolen plate. Within those walls, survival depended on submission or brutality, and Jake was not a violent man. The days passed cruelly. He counted the hours looking at the cracks in the wall, imagining how many stories of suffering were embedded in that dirty concrete. The time inside did not follow the same rules as the outside world. Outside, life went on. Inside, she stopped. Your family. He tried everything to prove his innocence. His wife made visits, took documents, begged someone to review the case. But the answer was always the same. The system does not make mistakes. Every time she left the prison with her eyes full of tears, Jake felt like he lost a piece of the hope he had left. The letters began to become less frequent. First weekly, then monthly, then silence. Visits became rare. Little by little, he realized that he was alone. The system didn't just lock him up, the system erased its existence. With each passing day, hope died a little more. Time didn't stop, and life outside continued without him. Now I ask you, how can anyone survive this? Do you believe that justice really works for everyone? Comment here, the system failed, because that is the only truth of this story. For years, Jake Thompson got used to the idea that that cramped cell would be his only reality. Time didn't heal, it just made suffering part of the routine. The days were all the same, marked by the metallic sound of closing bars, the endless counts of guards and the dirty walls that seemed to whisper stories of destroyed lives. He no longer expected justice, but then something happened, a little spark in the dark. One afternoon, a jailer called his name. The tone was not the usual one, full of contempt. There was something different. Would he be transferred? Another unfair punishment? He was taken to a room where a man in a suit was looking closely at a pile of papers on the table. His name was Richard Chapman, a criminal lawyer who had come across her case by chance. And at that moment, everything started to change. Chapman took off his glasses, watched Jake for a moment, and then said something he hadn't heard in a long time. "Let's fix this." Jake didn't react immediately. For years, empty promises were made to him. Believing required an effort that he no longer knew if it was worth it. But then, Chapman slid one of the documents across the table and asked him to read it. His eyes ran over the words and, for the first time, he saw the truth being laid out on paper. The real culprit had been arrested for another crime, and the most absurd. The system itself already knew this. Files forgotten inside dusty drawers proved that Jake could not have committed that crime. He was miles away when it all happened. Forensic reports ignored, contradictory testimonies that were conveniently left aside. The state made a mistake. Revolt rose like a fire inside him. 15 years. 15 years living a nightmare that could have been avoided if someone had simply looked at the evidence correctly. 15 years of suffering, loneliness, humiliation, while the real culprit remained at large. Chapman wasted no time. He reopened the case, demanded an immediate review, and within months, the truth finally came out. The system that condemned him without evidence was now forced to admit its error. But justice delayed is justice denied. The day of Jake's release has arrived. The prison's iron gate opened, and he walked out slowly, as if he still didn't believe that this moment was real. The world outside had changed. People passed by him without knowing that they were facing a man who lost 15 years of his life for a crime he never committed. Journalists fought for space. Headlines exploded on the news. Innocent. Men freed after 15 years. But none of those words could erase what happened. No newspaper article, no apology, no headline could give back the time that was stolen from him. The truth came out, but it was too late. Justice failed. After all, does a simple sorry do the trick? How can someone recover lost time, family, dignity, after having their life unfairly ripped away? 15 years erased, and no one will pay for it. Comment here. 15 stolen years, because this is not just Jake's story. It is the reality of many who have been forgotten by the system. The prison gate opened slowly, as if time wanted to drag that moment out even longer. Jake Thompson took a tentative step outside, feeling the cool air on his face for the first time in 15 years. But the freedom he had been waiting for was not accompanied by relief. His mind was still stuck in the memories, stuck in the pain, stuck in the reality that the world moved on without him. His eyes swept the parking lot. There was his sister, the only person who still came to visit in recent years. Her smile was forced, mixed with relief and sadness. It was a lonely reception. The wife he loved so much was not there. His son, the one he saw growing up only through worn-out photos that arrived less and less frequently, didn't come. And it was in that moment that he realized there was no longer a home to return to. The world didn't wait for him. The society that condemned him without proof now simply ignored him. He left, but he was never the same again. The first few days out of prison were a shock. The sounds, the colors, the movement of the streets, everything seemed distant, almost unreal. People passed by him without knowing that they were standing next to a man who had his life taken from him. 15 years out of the world. How can I get back now? He tried to find work, but his name was tarnished. Who would hire an ex-convict, even if he was innocent? Each interview ended with a suspicious look, a rehearsed apology, and the door closing once again. The prison doors opened, but the doors to society remained locked. He tried to rebuild ties, looked for his son, but time created a barrier that was impossible to break. The child who cried, watching his father being handcuffed, was now a man, a stranger who barely remembered his voice. And your wife? She moved on. He married again, built a new life. How can I blame her? 15 years is too long to wait for a ghost. Jake did not receive compensation. The government did not admit failure. No compensation was offered, no apology, nothing. As if your life was worthless. As if the years he lost were disposable. The system destroyed everything and now pretended it never existed. He walked the streets, seeing families gathered, people returning home after work, children running through the parks. All of that should have been his too, but he was ripped from his own story. How much is an innocent life worth? How much lost time can be repaired? How much suffering can be erased with a simple system error? Jake never had those answers. How do you move on after losing everything? After years of being locked up, without choices, without a voice, without justice? Where to start? Jake got out of prison, but never got back the life that was stolen from him. And how many still live this nightmare? Comment here, justice denied, because this story cannot be just one of many that the system insists on ignoring. Jake Thompson's story is sickening, But unfortunately, he wasn't the only one. The system fails every day, destroying lives without any consequences for those who make these mistakes. Now tell me, what do you think should happen to those responsible for this injustice? Do you believe the government should compensate people who spent years in prison for crimes they never committed? If you've made it this far, it's because this story impacted you. Comment here. The system failed, to show that these injustices will not be ignored. Each comment is a voice against silence, proof that we are not blind to this reality. If this story touched you in some way, imagine how many others still need to be told. Leave your like now so that more people know the truth and these injustices are not forgotten. And if you want to continue discovering cases that many would prefer to hide, come with us, sign up, and be part of this voice that doesn't let the system silence those who most need to be heard. What if I told you that this isn't even the worst story? What happened here is just one of the many absurd mistakes the system has made. In the next video, you will see a case that defies all logic, something so revolting that it is unbelievable. Get ready, because what comes next could completely change the way you view justice.